Great. Thank you, Olivia. I am so excited to be able to introduce my co-presenter, Jessica DeJong, who is one of the most multifaceted people here. She's a talented artist and creative director. She's a technologist who leads our front-end development team, and she's the mother to 3 beautiful cats. Also a human, I think, but the cats are so cute.
That's more relevant for the purpose of the webinar, I think.
Always.
And it's my pleasure to introduce Kalev Peekna. If you've never met Kalev before, you can remember how to pronounce his name. It rhymes with olive.
Oh, thanks.
Kalev is the chief strategist here. I'm not exactly sure what that entails, but I know he's widely regarded as one of the smartest people, if not the smartest at One North.
Oh, don't mean it.
And a fun tidbit about Kalev, which might make sense as we enter this fashion-themed webinar, is that Kalev owns, what was the count today? 142? 142 bow ties. So if you know Kalev, you've probably never seen him in the same bow tie twice.
Well, you need day bow ties, evening bow ties.
Yeah.
It gets complex. All right, y'all. It is Fashion Week, and we are so excited. Jessica called it my March Madness. I feel like that's totally true because this is an actual quote that I said in a meeting not too long ago, basically last year. If one more person interrupts this meeting to congratulate a grown man who bounces a ball for a living, I swear I'll stream Fashion Week on every monitor in this office.
That's a real quote.
I didn't get to make good on that threat. It is a real threat. I did not get to make good on that threat, so this webinar is our chance to do something similar.
But I always say that looking at trends is like watching a fashion show, right? You're probably not going to take that piece from the runway and wear it. I mean, at least I wouldn't. But it is still fun and inspirational to see what's happening out there and to get those creative juices flowing. So think about that as we approach the topic today.
And on that note, we are going to deliberately show you some things that are probably not from your home turf, not really within professional services, not even really a lot of corporate examples. There's a few, but not a lot. And to sort of explain why we do that, why are we pushing you and showing you things that don't seem directly relevant? Well, the first is, y'all spend way too much time looking at each other anyway. It's true.
So true.
It's true. If we were to come in here and say what's going on in professional services sites, chances are you would probably already know them, right? Like, we wouldn't be showing you anything new. We don't think it's our job to let you know what's going on with your peers in competition. We think you do a good job of keeping tabs on it anyway. We're here to show you, a little bit of a broader perspective. The second thing is that, this is a quote that we think
you had this written in your office.
I did, up on the board. Best practices lead to competence, not innovation. That doesn't mean they're bad. If you're behind on something or just getting started with something, they're a great place to start. But they are not innovative because by definition, if it's a best practice, people have done it before. And you just need to make sure that you understand that. And then finally, the last reason is simply sometimes you really have to leave the Shire to have a real venture. And
this is Kalev.
Yeah, take it from me. You can't see me right now, but everybody knows I'm basically a hobbit anyway. I don't have a hairy feet, though. You can't say that. Yeah, no, I don't have that. But more or less everything else is true. All right, let's get started.
This is what we're going to cover today. We have 4 what we're calling big ideas. They really transcend what I would call a trend. And those are things like artificial intelligence, the voice of brand, something really exciting called progressive web apps, and design thinking. So we're going to focus probably the first half of the webinar on those. And then we have 6 smaller trends that are a little bit more timely and more what I think of as a trend. And that's design systems, revenge of the mouse, Mondrianism, fluid geometry, black, and rebellious design. So we've got a mix of some pragmatic and some fun things we're going to go through today. So first, jumping right in, is artificial intelligence, something I'm sure everybody on this call has heard a lot about. There's a lot in the news. There are a lot of representations in pop culture. There have been movies. This is, the movie Her, Joaquin Phoenix, the operating system. If there are any Westworld fans out there from HBO, that's starting again soon, which I'm personally really excited about. So lots of representations in pop culture. And if you spend any time on the internet, you've definitely been inundated with all of the hype around AI. There's, tweets from Elon Musk, and there's news about Facebook having to shut down their AI programs, which is, that's a long story, but it's not really what it was hyped up to be. So it's hard to ignore all the hype around AI. So, I'm going to ask a rhetorical question. I know you guys are all muted, but who here is already working with AI? And
it's a trick question.
Trick question. We all are, right? So if you use Netflix's, recommended for you, if you have ever had Facebook's, facial recognition software help you tag a photo, credit card fraud, if you have any of the smart home devices, all of those are forms of artificial intelligence. There's a wide spectrum, and so we're all used to it. And we're going to talk today about how you can apply that to your marketing. So first, let's take a quick moment to just define what AI is. And at a very kind of basic level, AI is simply a machine's ability to parse large amounts of data and identify patterns in order to perform tasks that would otherwise require human intelligence. It includes, it's an umbrella term. It includes things like visual perception, speech recognition, decision-making, etc. It's definitely the buzzword of, du jour. You've probably heard all the big names in tech have invested in AI or acquired AI companies. Google's got a couple programs. They've got AlphaGo, Pair, Salesforce has Einstein, Adobe Sensei, IBM Watson, and the list goes on and on. So there's definitely a lot of hype around it, and Kalev was, great enough to find actual data around this type of hype. So here's a really interesting chart from Gartner, and you can see up here at the top, all of these topics are AI related. We've got connected home, deep learning, machine learning, autonomous vehicles.
Virtual systems,
all AI under that umbrella. And I think it's also interesting to point out, where we are. So if you look at kind of this spectrum down here, we're right now at the peak of inflated expectations. And I think a lot of the topics we're going to talk about today, probably are within this phase.
I think, the nice thing about the Gartner hype cycle, which they actually do update it on a regular basis, so it's always worth, I think, revisiting it, is, it points out the fact that just because something's hyped now doesn't mean it's going to live up to every expectation, but nor does it mean that it's just going to disappear and become a trend. All these things are going to be important, like we will go through the trough of disillusionment and before we get to the slope of enlightenment, but I think that's, it's just something to keep in mind as we talk about AI. And actually some of the other big ideas to say, like, there might be hype, that doesn't mean it's going to be irrelevant. You'll hear people talking about it maybe a little less next year, but we think these things are going to stick around. And once people start investing in them in a few years, like, they're going to become a standard part of what you think about as a marketer.
And so, we want to take what we know about AI specifically in marketing and talk a little bit about those, because that's the most applicable to you guys. So, within AI, we think about voice and chatbots, programmatic creative, using AI for search, using AI for personalization, marketing automation, and VR and AR. We'll dive into a couple examples of these. We don't have time to get into all of them. One of the first, I think, most prolific examples is voice-activated UIs. That can include things like any of those smart home devices. I have a couple Echo Dots at my house. We also have a Google Home. I've used Siri on my phone. All of those are a form of AI, and we're going to talk even more in the next section about voice and how that affects your brand. But just know that it's tied closely in with AI. This example from North Face is actually a great example of using AI to enhance search. And so what we do, what we find that the North Face is using is that they, rather than just having a straightforward search, filter, kind of that normal experience, they're using AI to ask a series of questions. Where are you going? What's the temperature there? What activity are you doing? And then they present, the results based on your answers to that. So it's much more conversational, but it's using AI behind the scenes. This is actually powered in partnership with IBM Watson. So just a really innovative use of search on a website. And I think this one is something that everyone on this call could probably take inspiration from. So next we're looking at, how VR and AR can augment or, complement digital retail experiences. So these are two examples. The photo that I have here is from the House iOS app, and then IKEA has a very similar one. These are in production right now. You can use these on your phone, and just a really interesting way to kind of explore the space around you. And I think the interesting point here that I want to kind of highlight is how much these VR and AR apps increased reaction and engagement. So the researchers from Nielsen found there was a 27% higher reaction in users, and engagement was 34% longer when these apps used VR and AR. So definitely really interesting. Here's another great example from the New York Times. The New York Times partnered with Hidden Figures, a great movie from last year. And what this is it's traditional content, but they're using VR and AR to just augment and complement this traditional content. So it's this really interesting mix of traditional with, newer AI-powered content. And then finally, we can't have a conversation around AI without talking about bots. They're everywhere, and there are almost too many examples to go into. So if you're interested in learning about bots, chatbots, brand bots, visit this site, the TopBot site, and they have an enormous kind of catalog. You can filter by different industries. There's, all types of industries are leveraging bots in really interesting ways, and I think that's something we're going to continue hearing more about. And that actually sets up the next topic, which I'm going to hand over to Kalev very nicely. We're going to talk about voice of brand.
Thank you. When we talk about voice of brand, this is something that's kind of related to AI. In fact, it's gotten a lot of popularity because of AI, but it's not the same thing, and it brings up some new dimensions, so we thought it was worth pausing. And what we're really talking about in this is the conversational user interface, and that's really any UI that mimics chatting with a real human. And that can be through a chat window, that can be through actual voice, like with an Amazon Alexa or something like that. But the point here is that instead of using like any kind of menuing system, clicking on stuff, that sort of thing, which we're used to using keyboard, mouse, touch, you're really just entering in commands in your own language, which means that a conversational interface is essentially turning your computer into Kramer on Seinfeld in that famous episode where movie phone gets directed to his apartment, and he realizes that it's a lot easier to just say, why don't you just tell me the name of the movie you want to see? That is basically what a conversational interface is. So there's a lot of them out in the wild. We've already talked about some of these, so I'm not even going to dwell on it. It's just that they are really, there's many of them, and I feel like every week when you go out looking for more, there's more to see. And that won't surprise you that there's a similar kind of hype about the conversational UI. There's lots of people out there, lots of thought leaders, even organizations like Google, talking about why it matters, talking about why it's really going to disrupt the way that we interact with technology, because it's bringing it down into our human terms, and it's not asking us to learn anything about how to use something. So here's some of the examples that we thought were the most interesting. The first, it really has to do with travel bots, but it's really like any people that are putting bots in through things like a chat service like Facebook Messenger. This example from KLM really allows you to execute some case studies that we said are fairly complex, so checking in, purchasing new flights, even changing your itinerary. And what they found is that users actually make fewer mistakes because the bot is able to focus and control the choices that they make rather than leaving them to a big open grid on a screen where it's a lot easier for people to click on the wrong thing. It's changing the way we do content consumption. The Quartz app has now been out for a little bit, and it's really different from their website. The website is a typical news magazine, I think, in many ways, lots of headlines, snippets, you dive in, you read an article. This really is, there's no traditional article. It's an app that gives you 5 things in the morning, 5 things in the afternoon. It'll cycle you through headlines, and the interface is like texting back and forth, complete with emojis. You can dive into a story, you can react to it, you can skip it and go to the next one. It's a really interesting way to sort of change the way you look at content. And right now, with the Olympics in Pyeongchang in South Korea.
This is a sports example?
I know, right?
I'm surprised.
I don't know, is figure skating a sport? We can have that debate. If they have good enough outfits, I'm willing to make some exceptions. So we'll call it fashion.
Okay,
right? There's so many secrets involved, right? The New York Times app is actually allowing a direct conversation with a journalist, Sam. So if you have the New York Times app on your phone, you can start interacting and following Sam as he goes through the Olympics, and he'll actually send you notifications, put questions about what sports you should be focusing in on, take player polls. What's happening is that it's a human, not a bot, and it's not a free-for-all chat. So I was afraid that there would be all these users, and it would be like the bottom half of the internet, like the comment section. It's not. You're really just going back to this one person. But it's a fascinating conversational way to explore the Olympics with a person at the center of it. And of course, we're all used to retail. This is why everybody's kind of gone nuts for Alexa, because we all know that eventually this is how the robots who replace us will get their new batteries. It's even showing a professional site. So quick example from Skadden, full disclosure, One North did design this site, and we always like to note that. Otherwise, any of the examples in this webinar are actually not by us at all. They use a conversational interface just to get people through what otherwise would have been a complex navigation sequence that helps people find the right information in their careers section. So it's pretty simple, straightforward, controlled responses, but it just shows you how this idea of using a conversational interface is starting to show up within professional sites. What I think is really interesting about conversational UIs isn't just the way it's changing the interface, but the impact that it has on brand. So the person who really started this line of thought for me is Professor Scott Galloway from the NYU Stern School of Business. His thesis is that conversational UIs could lead to the death of brand because they mediate between us and the brands that we want to interact with. They control our choice, and in many instances can just erase the brand experience. I don't have time to do his full thesis justice, so there's a link in the webinar deck if you want to go see his talk.
Seems like a dramatic headline.
It's a little over the top, and I think that, you know, when you see it that way, it leads to death of brand. I mean, I don't know how many times brand has been declared dead over the last 20 years, but like it's a zombie if it is, right? But here's, just to get a sense of what Scott Galloway is talking about, here's the sequence transcription between me and my actual Alexa at home just last week. So Alexa, I need batteries. To help me search, tell me more about what kind of batteries you need. I need AA batteries. Amazon's choice is Amazon Basic, AA batteries, 12 count. Would you like to buy it? And if you observe what happened is there's no choice of other options. There's no mention about brand. Of course, it pushes you to its own brand. This is what Scott Galloway is talking about. And, you know, you think, okay, well, that's not that big of a deal. The problem is it has happened before. The online travel agencies basically did this to the airline industry, and it had a profound impact on the industry, arguably leading to a lot of bankruptcies, certainly changing the way that they think about their product structure and their cost structure, and leading them to compete instead on price instead of on experience, which is the way that they used to compete. So just keep in mind that something that seems like an unrelated technological change, like just moving travel booking to the web and letting you do it yourself, can have really fundamental effects on the industry. So I think it's worth paying attention, even if you don't buy all his doom and gloom. The other thing I think it should lead you to think about is what's going on with the voice of your brand? You know, if you think about conversational UIs as through text or through voice, you need to ask some new questions about your brand that you didn't have to, right? What's the literal voice? Is it high, low, gender? What age is it? What accent? Like, where is it from? What's its personality? How does it interact? And even where does it come from? Like, what's its backstory? That was inspired by this article that I read about Facebook and an experiment that they were running where they realized when they were building a chatbot that people couldn't really relate to the chatbot and didn't talk to the chatbot like it was a human unless it was from somewhere, unless it had a consistent personality, and that giving it a personality in a sense that users could understand meant it had to have a backstory. And I thought that was a really fascinating observation on what it takes for us to start, you know, really working with AI. And so I think eventually it's not going to be very long, 5 years, maybe 10 years, before we're going to have to start answering these same sorts of questions for our own brands.
All right. So our third big idea is something called progressive web apps. So
we are so excited about this. If you've fallen asleep so far, wake up. This one's important.
So you'll hear me refer to it as PWAs. That's just shorthand for progressive web apps. And first I want to talk about the problem that PWAs are solving. And the problem is, before PWAs, if you wanted to reach a mobile audience, you had two choices. You could build a native app, so that's one that runs on iOS or Android or Windows, or you could build a responsive website. And there are pros and cons to both of those options, and you can kind of see that on the chart here. So, for example, if you went the native app route, you would get things, you'd get features like it could function offline. You can send your users push notifications. You can install an icon on the home screen. When they open your app, they get a full screen experience. They don't have all that, the browser Chrome that you get associated with a website. But then there are drawbacks to having a native app, right? The content that's in it is not indexable by search engines. You typically have to enter content in more than one place if you have a website and multiple native apps. They don't, by default, work across all devices. That's why you have to have, separate developments, for different operating systems. Right. It does require you to download it from the App Store, and then if you want to update it, you have to send that. You're at the mercy of, whenever Apple updates it. So pros and cons to the native app approach. And then, the next column, responsive websites, are essentially the inverse of that. So all the things you can do with a native app, often you can't do with a traditional responsive website, but there are some other, pros in that column. So, that's kind of frustrating. There should be a better way to reach the mobile audience, and that's what, that's what progressive web apps do. So the next, screen basically takes all of those features, and progressive web apps check all those boxes. So everything that you can do, almost everything you can do on a native app, almost everything you can do on a responsive website, you can do with PWAs. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about them. PWAs are really new. It's a concept introduced by Google, less than 2 years ago at one of their I/O conferences. And essentially, they're pretty simple. They are, at their core, it's a responsive website, but it acts and feels like a native app. So it's taking the best of both worlds. So this is a screenshot of, Starbucks has released a PWA. You access it just like you access any other website on your phone. You type in a URL in the URL bar. But when you interact with it, you use it just like you use a native app. So it's just really interesting, where those two kind of interplay. Yeah, another way to think about it, I've read, in one of the articles I read, that PWAs are websites that took their vitamins. It's really just setting a higher bar for the user experience on websites, particularly mobile websites. So, what constitutes a PWA? There are really kind of 9 core characteristics that I'm going to go through quickly here. So you see them listed on your screen. So first is progressive. That's in the name. And what do I mean by progressive? Well, at its base, it is a website, but there are enhanced features that you can access on certain devices and browsers, such as push notifications, right? You're not going to get a push notification, at least now, on your desktop, but you could on a mobile device. But the core functionality of the content being accessed through a website, always available. Responsive, I don't need to spend much time on this. It's a responsive website, so it works across all devices. It's discoverable. Search engines can find your content. It's app-like, so when you launch a progressive web app, it can go full screen and feel just like a native app. Connectivity independent. It works offline or in areas of low connection. It's linkable. So the content lives on the web because it's a website, and so you can link to it through social media or other websites that you link to. You're not often able to do that on native apps. You can enable push notifications. This is a great way to promote re-engagement with your users or to personalize those push notifications to them. It's easier and faster, and I mean easier and faster in lots of different ways. It's easier and faster to develop it. It's easier and faster to deploy it. You only have to do it once rather than across multiple operating systems. And then when you need to update it, I said this before, you don't have to wait for Apple to approve your update. You just update it like you update any other page on the web. And finally, it's installable on the home screen. So when a user visits your PWA, they often will get a prompt, depending on the browser they're using, to save that to their home screen. And then it lives in that same ecosystem with all the other apps on their phone. So pretty cool stuff. So now let's look at a couple examples. I'm not going to look at all of these, but all of the logos, all of the companies you see up on my screen right now have all released PWAs within the last probably 8 to 10 months. So it's very new. Even companies like Twitter and Starbucks have just gotten into the game here. So if you haven't done a PWA, you're not necessarily behind yet. The first one I'm going to look at is the Washington Post. They were one of the first news sources to experiment with PWAs. And what I'm going to do is show you a screen, the video, and the PWA version is on the left, and their mobile site is on the right. And you can see just how much faster the PWA loads. So again, the PWA is over here on the left. That loaded in 0.9 seconds. The original mobile site took over 3 seconds to load. And you can see just how quickly that happens. So it's pretty meaningful. Another one that I really like is Uber's PWA. If you want to experiment with that, it's m.uber.com. Just type that in on your phone. It's designed to work really well on intermittent networks. It's 3 seconds to interactive on 2G, which is pretty amazing. And so, one really cool thing that I noticed right when I started using it is this screen right here. So I was out and about on the street in an area of low connection, and before I could even type in my destination, it asked me, do you want to load the map? And it told me that loading the map may slow down the experience. And I didn't really need the map. I knew the address of where I was going, and so I hit no, and I was able to, hail an Uber really, really quickly. The Starbucks app, which I told you I use all the time, it's, a fraction of the size of its native app counterpart. I don't know that I noticed that. What I noticed was the UX was better. So when I'm standing in line at Starbucks in the morning, all I need to do is hit pay, and on my native app, it was 3 clicks away. And I noticed here on the PWA, it's a persistent green button right by where my thumb sits. And I actually noticed that they're updating their native app to follow this UX pattern. So I think it just forced them to really rethink the whole user experience. So we are really excited about PWAs. Hopefully we generated a little bit of interest for those of you that weren't aware of it. So you might be wondering now, is a PWA right for my project? There are a couple things that I think make a project a really good candidate. It's great for content that encourages regular engagement. It's great for audiences that are largely mobile. If you have existing apps or thinking about launching or developing an app, take a pause and let's talk about PWAs. We've talked with lots of clients so far about potential projects, and so you can start to think about things like thought leadership portals, events, recruiting, business development tools, lots of different applications for that. So really exciting stuff.
Great. Yeah, we are so excited about that. The next big idea, the last big idea that we have is design thinking, which is a term that I think a lot of people have been talking about for the last couple of years. We'll start with just the definition by the guy who coined the term. He's the CEO of an agency in the Silicon Valley called Odeo. Design thinking is a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for business success. So in a nutshell, you can sort of think about it like this, that design thinking is what happens when you ask your designer to do your strategy rather than your finance person, your accountant, or your big corporate MBA. Right? So another way to imagine it is that, design is used to thinking sort of down the stream in a solution framework. This is a pretty typical solutions tackling lots of different kinds of strategic or technology processes. I think we're all pretty used to projects that follow this sort of thing. In a design thinking world, what they do is rethink the entire upfront process all the way up until something actually gets built and released as design. And it not only do they reimagine that and reimagine how that happens, they also commit to a more flexible and iterative process. So they go as fast and hard as they can to get something out and then count on the ability that they'll be able to repeat, refine, and make that thing better over several iterations over time. And in that sense, design thinking very much does dovetail up to agile methodologies and other trends in corporate technology strategy that really fit nicely with design thinking. And I don't think that's an accident. I think all these things are basically echoing off each other and realizing that we can approach strategy and design and technology using the same sort of fundamental rhythms. So their core principles about design thinking are listed out here. I would say the ones that are the little bit hardest to get over if you're coming in from the outside. It doesn't matter, I think, if you're actually from a creative background, marketing background, technology background. I think we all have these same obstacles. The first is that it's not a process. And in that sense, it's really different from Six Sigma and other corporate methodologies. There's no set of steps that you can follow, start at this place, end at this place, where you can say, if I follow these steps, I have design thought. That is just not a thing. And what you'll see is that a lot of people who do practice this, including the people at One North, is they say, look, it's really just a toolbox of techniques. I have a bunch of different things I can do to help, create the idea, design the idea, refine the idea, but there's no real, sequence of steps. It's just not how it works. The other thing I would say is that it's really collaborative, and that's actually different from the way a lot of traditional design goes, because they don't believe in the myth of the lone genius designer. They believe in teams. And the final one is really for managers of teams. It's nonlinear, and I got to tell you, I'm a manager of these teams sometimes. It's really frustrating and or scary making, because suddenly a design thinking team will look like it's heading in the opposite direction, but you just got to trust that they're doing that for the right reasons. I like to think of it as the chaos that fights chaos, which is precisely what makes it so good at dealing with disruptions or threats or a need for it. So there are 3 core modes. Rather than like deal on these theoretically, I'm just going to dive into these modes, which is what they're called in the design thinking world, and show you what's inside of them, like what's in the toolbox. So the first one's inspiration. I think it kind of shocks people when they first look at it because it's not what we're used to thinking of inspiration. No one's going for a walk on the beach or like waiting for like the light bulb to go off on their head or like, you know, bringing out Headscape and going through some quasi-Zen meditation. That's not what inspiration looks like to them. It's actually a really in-depth activity. But you'll notice from some of these things that what they're really doing is researching people. Design thinkers start and get their ideas by learning as much as they can about the people involved. Whether it's a product, service, whatever they're investigating, they want to know. And so these techniques, from sitting down with an interview to having people do a collage or drawing with them, to just an immersive study, which can be as simple as like following somebody around for a day to see what their life is really like, that's where design thinkers find inspiration. When it comes to ideation, like coming up with ideas, I think the big difference from some more traditional brainstorming is that they are fundamentally collaborative. This is not about some one person coming up with an idea, but with a team coming up and finding the idea. So there's lots of different techniques. This is often where people like to start when they get first involved with design thinking, because they get, I think, pretty inspired by what these techniques look like. So, and I would recommend that. Like, if you want to get a taste of it, investigate, the way that design thinking does brainstorming, and I think you'll find that it's a lot more productive. Finally, with implementation, it sounds weird, like designers don't implement, they don't build, they design. But in their mind, what they're really talking about is prototyping. And in a design thinker's world, anything can be prototyped. When you have a product, that seems obvious. I build a small version of what that product is. But when you have a service, or even if you're talking about content, there are ways that you can do a prototype, and that can be simply as simple as like telling a story or drawing up and illustrating a scenario about what you want to have happen. There's always a way to prototype. If you want to do some more reading, there's lots of stuff out here. These 4 books are on my desk. Surprise, Professor Kalev is giving you homework.
Yep.
Here, I have all of these books. They sit on my desk. I refer to them often. I've arranged them from going from the left, from like I'm just getting interested. The Harvard Business Review did their September 2015 issue. It was all about design thinking. The 2 middle books, including Tim Brown, the originator of this term anyway, I'd say that's a good stage if you want to, like, you think that it's interesting and you want to find out how it works. So it's finally like, I'm ready to get started, give me the hardcore how to do it kind of thinking. So I really recommend you dive in if you want to find more about it. So just really briefly, some examples to tie this up. In Oakland, California, they were really dealing with an issue that I think parents everywhere deal with. Childcare is really expensive, often inconvenient, and ironically, it's even worse in like high-cost, low-income areas like Oakland. Like, they often have the fewest options for childcare, but even if they have the greatest need. So they hired a design thinking team at T Labs to come in and try to crack this. And instead of coming at it from a financial or policy perspective, like they could have analyzed the income base, researched the child care options, proposed a tax, or talked about like the costs, maybe put in a tax credit to parents, which has been done before. What they did was create a peer-to-peer network, like a website, that brings a untapped source of labor, mainly retired grandmothers, to the market, and in an affordable way. And they created this sort of market. They basically created a freestanding market for childcare that hadn't existed before. And the reason why they were able to do that is because they didn't look at the financials. Instead, the team literally followed some of the parents around for their day-to-day lives, and eventually they ended up at a meeting, a community meeting, where they noticed that there were all these older people sitting around the sidelines watching the children, and realized these are the grandparents watching the children while the parents participated in the meeting, and they started talking to the grandparents and realized, yeah, they'd be willing to watch children, or not even their own grandchildren, and that's how the core idea got started. So that's design thinking working the way it really wants, or the way it really can, and showing off the best of what it can do. If you could be a little skeptical about, like, can this really work in such a structured context as a professional service organization, like a consulting firm or a law firm or accountancy, the answer is yes, and there's been people doing it. So if you're interested, I would check out what Ed Bonesek at Miles and Stockbridge is doing. He's and his team are actively using design thinking techniques to examine and make improvements across candidate experience, employee experience, visitor experience, outreach experience, which is how he talks about traditional marketing and communication. even down to the actual client service experience. He's published a couple pieces out on LinkedIn. So by all means, if you want to take a look at, how does design thinking work in a context that's a little bit more like my own, take a look at what he's doing.
So those are the 4 big ideas, and next we're going to kind of quickly go through 6 smaller ideas, or what we see as more trends in the space, and we'll move through these a little bit more quickly. So the first up is design systems. You may have heard, the term before, but you may have also heard terms like atomic design, pattern library, design language, digital style guide, design standards, et cetera, et cetera. There are some nuanced differences between them, but more or less we're talking about the same thing. So design systems of the past, looked like this. This is kind of a traditional, this is NASA's branding, and it was a book that you got printed, you slammed it on everyone's desk, and it didn't change, which that's great when you need to put your logo on the side of a rocket ship, but our needs have changed quite a bit since then, and we need something that's more adaptable. And so what we have now, this video is kind of an illustration of all the different, screen sizes and components and modules that your brand can touch. And so we need to account and document for all of those situations. So in this age of device diversity, rather than focusing on pages, we want to focus more on patterns, repeatable patterns. And digital design systems are the answer to that. So I'm going to look at 2 examples, Google and IBM, just kind of show you, what's happening out there. So Google's called Material Design. You can Google it. It's materialdesign.io.
You can Google Google.
You can Google Google. I didn't realize I did that, so thanks for pointing that out. And so within this, one of the more interesting parts is all these style guides are available on the web. They're not hiding, on some intranet that you need special access for. This is out there for the world. And they've got all the traditional, style elements, color, imagery, things like that you would expect. But then they start to get into, reusable components, patterns, usability, including things like accessibility, which is a topic that's coming up a lot in conversations that we have with clients. And so they're documenting, they're documenting, their philosophy on it and then how to get there.
What I think is really impressive about Google is that, a traditional brand guideline would give you probably logo, typography, some colors, and then like 10 more pages of what not to do with all of those.
Don't do this.
Don't do this, don't do this. They're almost written by people, often it feels like, by people who don't really want you anywhere near the brand, right? They're longer on the restrictions than what you can do. And Google doesn't have restrictions at all. It's really about equipping people, guiding them, giving them the actual tools, not just, something to read and being told what to do. Like they actually give you this patterns, they give you the typography, they give you everything you need to like get up and run and use it. And I think that's one of the biggest differences between the design system and the old brand guide.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. That's a huge shift that's happened. And it's interesting that you say that because, IBM has been around for a very long time. And so we've kind of observed this shift happen in their branding. A lot of the elements on IBM's living language, these are elements that have been around. Core design, features of their brand have been around for 30 plus years.
Even that version of the logo is at least 40 years old. That shocks most people who look at it.
But then once you start to get into, how they're documenting, how they're talking about their brand, the tools that they're giving you, they've definitely made the leap into digital. So they've got an icon library, they've got an animation library. Starting to talk about movement, how my brand moves. Going back to what Kalev said earlier, I think a lot of these design systems should and will start to include the voice of their brand in there. And again, these are all resources available online. I really encourage you to go check them out. The Google and IBM are kind of famous examples, but if you're really interested in this, I recommend checking out styleguides.io. There are hundreds of corporations and companies and organizations. I think, USA.gov is on there. They've all uploaded their style guide here. When I took this screenshot the other day, there were 520 that had been uploaded. And so you can just see what everyone else is doing. And I just like the inclusive nature, the openness that this kind of promotes. So kind of cool. Another small aspect of the design systems trend that we've observed is this idea of responsive logos. So because we have to account for all these different devices and use cases for your brand, you can't just have the one logo format anymore. And so what we're starting to see in these design systems is people thinking about how to kind of break down their logo into its smallest format. You can imagine something like this sitting in your browser tab in the favicon or in a Twitter avatar. And I think, one of the interesting things, all these brands, at least most of them, are old brands. So
they're all over 100 years.
They were designed before Twitter existed, before you needed a favicon, and it still shows that you can continue to break down a logo into its most kind of fundamental feature and still make it recognizable. I think
this is one of the easiest and simplest ways to just go through and update your brand and make it ready for digital, because I'm sure you've been just done the same thing. It can be tough to take the logos that have the amount of information on the left, which we're sometimes asked to do, and then put it in the top left of the mobile site.
Mm-hmm.
It basically starts to become readable. So it's just something. Ask your agency, ask your brand people, to maybe your own creative department, whoever you've got, to build out this system so that everyone knows what to do.
Yeah, I think this is something that almost everyone can add to their action list for this year, and it's very valuable. Now we're going to start to get into some purely visual trends. These are some of my favorites, and these are really fun. So we've got some cool examples. So Mondrianism. If you ever took an art history class, you've probably heard of Mondrian. If you have not taken an art history class, you've almost undoubtedly seen his work. Very famous, very abstract, very geometric, heavily using just a couple primary colors as well as black and white. So we started to notice this about a year ago. This isn't a website. This is a print campaign. And really strong influence from Mondrian. Not exact, but a very strong influence. And then we noticed at the Grammys this year, this is a performance by Cardi B, and you're seeing all those same, geometric shapes, those primary colors. And so we're seeing it kind of across different uses. And then, of course, as we would expect, web starts to pay attention, and we start to see this idea of Mondrianism pop up in web design. I think one of the more interesting parts is, you can see here in this animation, they're really using the geometry of these shapes to enhance the animation. It's very structured and provides kind of a good foundation for some of those cooler interactions. Now the next trend is called fluid geometry, and it is literally the opposite of what I just talked about, which is appropriate because some of these trends might really resonate with you and might feel right for your brand, and others might feel way off, and that's okay. These trends are, they kind of run the full spectrum. So, this trend is, we're seeing a lot of sites that have organic shapes with subtle movement, different gradations of color, just kind of really interesting plays on that. So here's one example. You can see these shapes as I kind of click around. They move, and they just kind of undulate, and it's just, it's very organic. This next example is a little bit more subtle. When I land on the page, the blues kind of just wave around like that. But it really, I think it's a really good use of the medium and using animation to kind of bring a flat interface to life. Here's one that's using dimension with organic shapes, so you can kind of feel like you're almost going into it. And then here's one more example that's using, really vibrant colors. We're still seeing a lot of gradients. Gradients were a trend we talked about last year. I'm still seeing a lot of that. This is just kind of a more modern version of that. All right, well, this next one is Kalev. I'll let him talk about it, but it might not be a surprise that I designed this slide.
10 points to Gryffindor for this. All right, so one of the interesting things that in kind of web design in general is that we used to rely a lot on mouse interactions and hovers for a lot of interactivity. And with the rise of touch interfaces, a lot of us stepped back because we were really trying to build websites for touch, right? And that's phones, tablets, even touch desktop computers like Microsoft Surface computers and some HP touch computers. But what we started to understand as we had to do some more websites, we've seen a lot of people reinvigorate how they use the mouse to improve the interactivity. So you'll see in some of these examples that I'm showing is that you can see the mouse move around the screen, and often, the way it works is that as it hovers over certain things, it creates more focus. You see that it draws a circle around the menu. That kind of focus isn't just, something that's cool or interesting. This one looks a little bit like the laser pointer. So again, another cat coming in. But you can see what it's doing is actually enhancing the usability. So it's not just visual interest. It's creating more visual focus, letting you understand what can be clicked on and what can't. It's really helping you navigate through a more immersive experience. And that's just some of the most interesting work we've done just in terms of designing for a mouse-driven interface. So I guess the lesson is you can still make things responsive, you can still make them touch-friendly, but it doesn't mean you have to abandon the sort of enhanced experience that's possible on a desktop. You know, this next trend is almost a throwaway. We almost didn't include it, except it was so dominant. We felt like we had to say.
I mean, even the last examples that you showed.
Right, exactly. You've already seen this on a lot of our examples, which black is back. It never goes away. Jessica actually brought this up years ago, pointing out some human interaction research that showed that black led to a strong association with, you know, premium brands, high-end type service. We are really beginning to see it take off. I think it's always been the case. I think it was limited to those truly premium luxury brands. Now we're seeing it show up in things that are not retail, not products, not really luxury. Global IQ is this finance firm. You can see that Derek Pat really dominates their landing page. This is a Russian B2B manufacturer. I think that what's interesting about the way that they've leveraged black is their primary brand color. But is that they are not, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily monochromatic. They're letting their own products bring in some additional color. The black doesn't mean that it has to be funereal, but it's still the dominant brand color. We are seeing it show up in professional services like this law firm. We do know this got a lot of chatter, at least within the legal industry when it launched. Leaving aside whether you think it's good or bad, you like it or not, we just thought it was interesting to show like how strongly they've led with black as a brand color. And we've used it ourselves. Full disclosure, this is one of the only two examples where this is One North you're looking at, but we thought it was worth showing you how you leverage black, less as more as a tone rather than a specific black color, but how you can leverage it to add a certain amount of seriousness or gravitas, and really create that kind of like up-end, like higher-end feel to a website.
All right, so we've reached the final trend, and it's probably the most fun, but also the most polarizing, and that's rebellious design. So, full disclosure, about a year ago, I gave another trends webinar, and the last trend that I talked about with my colleague Nate at the time was, you know, something called brutalism, and we both kind of predicted that this was going to be a quick rise and fall of this trend, and boy, was I wrong about that. It is everywhere now. I've extended this trend to not just be brutalism, but all sorts of kind of rebellious ways that designers and companies are finding to rebel against design. So we're using kind of harsh color palettes, you know, a lot of neon I'm seeing, really unexpected typography.
Undesigned.
They're anti-design, they're anti-UX. I mean, you know, vertical text, text that's hard to read, just all sorts of ways to push boundaries. Not all are good, so just kind of full disclosure with some of the examples we're going to show you. We're not promoting these, but it's a trend we can't ignore now. So here's kind of a good example. I mean, this is an art museum in the Netherlands. I'm not surprised to see, you know, these more artistic organizations pushing boundaries.
It was kind of Bauhaus feel.
Yeah, I'd say this is, I'd agree, more Bauhaus than brutalist. This was a long-form piece of featured content that Huffington Post put out. I think it's completely appropriate to use this, you know, brutalist, dark palette, neon colors for this audience. It's actually an article about how millennials are in kind of this precarious financial situation. So they're using, you know, they're kind of combining a lot of the trends that we've seen. They're using black, they're using neon, they're using this kind of asymmetrical grid. It's a really interesting piece, and it's, you know, I think this is a good example for when it makes sense to leverage a trend. Dropbox evolved their brand. I think you can go, it's dropbox.design if you want to dig into it more. But they're really getting away from just that kind of corporate blue and white color palette. They're using actually a ton of unexpected pairings, some of them that don't work well together, but that's kind of the point, is that, you know, they're just really pushing boundaries for when to use color, how to use it. So that's a kind of more mainstream example that followed that. Now this one is really pushing the edge of it.
I don't like it.
Kalev hates it.
Hey.
I mean, I don't like it either, to be honest. It's anti-design. This is the Yale School of Art, though. This is not some, you know, community. Yeah, it is. You know, it is a sophisticated brand. This is an Ivy League school. This is. So it's just so interesting that they would leverage a trend like this. I think you had some good UX observations.
Yeah,
about it.
I mean, it's an excellent
not
school.
Just visual.
The portrait artist just did Obama's official portrait, went to the school, so it's not denying that they know art. This one, though, you know, to me, it's kind of related to the same sort of 1930s aesthetic or something. They use the fancy German term, the Verfremdungs effect. I think, which basically means alienation effect, I think this design is intended to create distance between the user and the site itself. I think a lot of it, what it's doing is really unfriendly on purpose. I think it's kind of thumbing its nose at usability, convention, at hierarchy, at clarity. Like, I think it's really trying to almost make things a little bit more difficult to define what you want or to understand what's going on. And yeah, I'm not a big fan of that. I mean, I understand what they're doing.
And you don't have to like everything. That is totally fine. The next two examples do bring kind of our theme full circle back to New York Fashion Week, and they are fascinating. So I actually encourage you to go to both of these. The first one is... This
one I love, yeah.
This is the Balenciaga site. So I'm not quite as up on my European fashion houses as Kalev, but that's...
You don't know Christopher Balenciaga?
That's another webinar that we'll invite you guys to. So the interesting part, this is the Balenciaga homepage, and Balenciaga has, is known for these highly sculptural pieces, definitely not minimalism.
Almost massive.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The interesting part about both the design and the UX is how functional it is for their purpose. They're using their website to feature their products, to feature their designs. So if I start to click in here, I mean, the homepage is basically a menu. Then I get to a secondary screen. It's really easy to navigate. And as soon as I get to this ready-to-wear page, it's all white except for the clothes. So it's almost like a fashion show or an art gallery. It really lets the products speak for themselves without any distraction anywhere else. And then you can kind of continue to navigate. So they've really gone completely all in on this theme. And it's just a really interesting use of minimalism, an extreme version of minimalism, and a little bit of brutalism.
And not surprisingly, it's really consistent across devices. Mm-hmm. Even though how that's part of the reason. But I love the way it really just lets the product be the design.
And it's highly performant because there's not any background images or anything like that. So there are definitely pros to some of these approaches. The final example is probably our most fun example and definitely the most polarizing. This, not just because there's a cat on her head, but that is a cool part of it. We
were trying to discuss the technical term for this kind of design, and I think you nailed it.
Yeah, it's bonkers. It's totally bonkers.
It's totally bonkers.
So this is not the main Gucci site. This is gifts.gucci.com, but this is Gucci. Like, everybody knows Gucci. Again, very expensive, very high-end, known for luxury. And it is
also known for excess.
It is totally unexpected. You're seeing a lot of the rebellious design trends. You're seeing neon in that big hamburger menu. Lots of cats, big fan of that. Lots of really bright colors. They are featuring a lot of their products on here, though. I love this, the play on the name. I mean, it's so irreverent. It's so against kind of the just storied history of the brand. But I have to say, we went back to the site 20 times when we were prepping for this webinar. It's fascinating, and if the point is to get you to explore gifts on Gucci, it succeeded. So, to bring this kind of full circle, I think we're not recommending that you take this webinar and go pitch it for your next web project. I think, a lot of what we've shown are meant to be inspiration, not prescriptions.
Yeah, and I agree. We're not asking you to copy any of these. We're just hoping that they spark some thought. Second thing I would say is, like, when we show you some of the examples, it's perfectly fine if you just don't like the examples, but our advice is don't let the specific aesthetics for those examples distract you. Think about the broader trend if you're wondering, like, will it apply to me or not, rather than I didn't like the site that Kalev or Jessica showed. I think the final thing is, if you want to experiment, and which is something we love, think about those more focused or defined campaigns. I mean, with any trend, I don't know that we would say go whole hog and redesign your entire site around it, specialize on it. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to run specific content campaigns or digital campaigns and see how you can leverage one of these things for your brand.
Yeah. Well, that's all we have today. So thank you guys so much. We hope this was a fun way to spend an hour of your afternoon. We hope it was inspirational for you. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Tanya and Olivia.